All right. Well, as we were talking about Halloween, as we've been kind of meeting about Halloween the last couple weeks and things, it's been getting me exciting because I remember back when I was a kid, and I trick-or-treated in these same streets in Haddon Heights. So every year when I see the kids all dressed up, it reminds me of one of my favorite things about Halloween, which was getting to wear all the different costumes, and figuring out what I wanted to have for a costume for Halloween. Now, in my household, we did things a little differently. My parents never took us out and took us to a store and said, "Oh, buy a costume or something." We always had to kind of scrounge around the house to make a costume. I don't know if you were like that. So, I had a couple choices. I could be awkward, poorly dressed 70s kid, but I was that most of the day, so I want to be different. So I usually went as a hobo, because that was kind of the easiest thing to be at, to be. But deep down, I always wanted to go out and get a costume of one thing: Superman. I wanted to it would be so cool to be out there, out there on the streets, getting candy and protecting the neighborhood from evil. And, that would just be awesome. But, as I got older, that whole romantic notion of being Superman kind of started to fade as I came to an important conclusion. And it was this: no matter how authentic I looked as Superman, no matter how much I made myself look the part, the reality was I would never be Superman. I couldn't leap tall buildings in a single bound. And if I were to climb to my roof and jump off, I would be hit with the reality and probably with the sidewalk very quickly that I'm not Superman. I can't fly. I can't do these things, right? You see, no matter how much I changed the outside to look the part, I would never be and could never be Superman, because that wasn't who I was on the inside. And as I kind of thought about this, I thought, sometimes we can be like this in our spiritual lives, can't we? We can try to put on all the outward appearances of, that super spiritual person. But if our heart's unchanged, then we're just kind of playing dress up as followers of Jesus. And this is actually what we find in the prophet Haggai in his third message that he shares to these remnant returners that are tasked with rebuilding God's temple in Jerusalem. So today we return to the Old Testament book of Haggai, and we're in chapter 2. So I want to ask you to turn to chapter 2 because we're going to spend some time in there. Remember, Haggai's real small. Packs a huge punch, but it's real small. It's only 2 chapters long. It sits between the Z's, between Zephaniah and Zechariah, 3 books to the end of the Old Testament, from the end of the Old Testament. So you can kind of turn there. And as you're turning there, as you're looking for it, I just want to kind of recap, because it's been a few weeks since we've been in Haggai, and I want to kind of recap the whole setting, because his message kind of gets lost if we don't understand really what's going on. So here's what's going on. The people of Judah, God's chosen people, right? They were taken into captivity by the Babylonians and then the Persians. So they spent all this time in captivity until 538 BC. And King Cyrus of Persia decides to allow the Jews to return back to Jerusalem so they can rebuild God's temple, which lay in ruins when they were initially invaded. So he allows them to come back, but only a small remnant go back, led by this guy Zerubbabel and the high priest named Joshua. And they all go back and they return to Jerusalem and they get to work at starting to rebuild this temple. In fact, in 2 years, they have kind of the foundation set of the temple, or it laid out. But then they get distracted. They realize, man, we don't have any place to live either. We got to take care of ourselves. And then opposition started to come from hostile neighbors, and they started to so that they stopped work. In fact, it was 16 years since they last worked on the temple that God sends a message to them, actually a messenger to them, in this prophet Haggai. And basically he wants Haggai to come and to tell them to get back to work, right? So God has Haggai share 4 messages over the course of a couple months to this remnant to help build not just the temple, but build faithfulness in his people. And the first message that we saw in chapter 1 was all about priorities, right? It was kind of an indictment against the people where Haggai's saying, you know what? You guys got to get back to work. You guys have been putting your own needs over God's priorities. And you got to get your priorities straight. God should be first in all that we do. And the people responded to this. In fact, they repented. And very soon they got back to work on this temple. A month later, they're starting to work on the temple and things, and the enormity of the task kind of hits them. And they start looking around and saying, man, we're just a few people. How are we going to build this thing? And besides that, it looks horrible because we don't have the resources that Solomon had when he first built the temple. So what can we do? So God sends Haggai with a second message to encourage them. And this message was all about clarity. Basically, he wanted them to clearly see that God was with them and God was for them. So even in building the temple, God's got you and you'll be okay. So work's moving along here on this temple now. When God sends Haggai back, just a couple months later, with another message designed to help build their faithfulness. And this is what we find beginning in verse 10. So we're going to read starting in verse 10, and then we're going to talk about what this message of Haggai was all about. So join me in reading as we read starting in verse 10. It says, on the 24th day of the 9th month, second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Haggai the prophet. So it's 2 months later, right? The last one was the 7th month, the 21st day. Now we have the 9th month, the 24th day. So 2 months later. And the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet. Thus says the Lord of hosts. Remember, Haggai says, I'm not speaking for myself here. Don't get mad at me. Don't think less of me. Don't think more of me. This is what God is saying to you. And he says, thus says the Lord of hosts. Ask the priest about the law. If someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? The priest answered and said, no. Then Haggai said, if someone who's unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? The priest answered and says, it does become unclean. Then Haggai answered and said, so is it with the people and with the nation before me, declares the Lord. And so with every work of their hands and what they offer there is unclean. Now then, consider from this day onward, before stone was placed upon stone in the temple of the Lord, how did you fare? When one came to a heap of 20 measures, there were but 10. When one came to the wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were but 20. I struck you and all the products of your toil with blight and with mildew and with hail, yet you did not turn to me, declares the Lord. Consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, since the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider, is the seed yet in the barn? Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, the olive tree have yielded nothing. But from this day on, I will bless you. So this is Haggai's message. His first message was kind of one of challenge, right? He's challenging the people. His second message was one of encouragement. And this third message is kind of a mix between the two. He's challenging the people, but he's also encouraging them. And what he's encouraging them with is to be holy, to have your heart devoted to God. So he opens with a setting. It's 2 months after this point, and he says, here's what God has me to say. And he presents 2 scenarios, right? 2 kind of parables or 2 questions that he asks to the priest. These are legal questions, and asks them to the priest about this law, the law given to the people, right? And the first one is about these animal sacrifices that were offered to God. You see, and they would bring a sacrifice to God. People would bring to the priest the sacrifice to God, and they would offer the sacrifice. The meat left over was just as holy as the sacrifice that was offered. But the meat left over was then given to the priests so they could eat it. And what they would often do is they would take this extra meat and they would wrap it in a garment or a cloth, and then they would take it home so they could eat it. And it says in Leviticus chapter 6 that this meat was holy. So they would wrap it in this garment. So what the question then is if you had this meat and it was wrapped in this garment or wrapped in this cloth, and it was this holy meat, if it brushes up against this garment, this cloth brushes up against any other kind of food that you might have, like you're putting it on a table and it hits something else, does that make that food holy too? Or does the holiness rub off, basically? And the legal experts of the day said, no, not according to the law. This holiness doesn't rub off. It doesn't become holy just because it's in close proximity to something holy. So that answer came back no. And then he offers a second question. He says, all right, let me give you another scenario. Suppose there's this guy and he touches a dead body, which makes him ceremonially unclean. And Leviticus 24 talks about this. And he says, so if this guy who's ceremonially unclean touches any of this food, does that food then become unclean? And the answer, according to the law, is yes, it becomes unclean. So, what's behind these two questions? What is Haggai getting at? These questions, here it is. Holiness is not contagious. Sin is. Holiness isn't contagious, but sin is. So to kind of bring this up and understand it for our day today, these questions that he's asking, is something like this. A healthy person can't make a sick person well, but a sick person can make a healthy person sick, right? If you put two people in a room, one's sick, one's healthy, the sick person isn't going to be well just by being close to a healthy person. But the sick person can very easily get the healthy person sick, right? That's why we're wearing masks right now, because we don't want to get anybody else sick. So that's kind of what he's talking about. Or think of it another way. You have milk. How many people have ever had milk and you forgot about it and left it in your fridge way too long? What happens to it? It spoils. It gets sour, right? Now, you have this sour milk. Can you fix this sour milk by going to the store and getting some good milk and mixing it in with the sour milk? And you mix enough of that good milk in there and it makes the sour milk well again. Good. No, what happens to it? The sour milk makes the good milk sour as well. That's what Haggai's saying here. Holiness isn't contagious, but sin is. Sometimes when it comes to us and God, we try to deal with our sin like this, like we do with the milk, We say, yeah, I have all this sin, and it's bad stuff. But if I can just do enough good stuff for God, it's going to kind of tip the scales back, and so it'll be good again. Have you ever gotten to that thinking? I know I've had times where I've done that and say, okay, I've done this bad, I better make up for it by doing a bunch of good. Basically, Haggai's saying it doesn't work that way, right? Because we can't overcome sin. We miss that holiness, it's not about our actions, it's about our heart. And then Haggai concludes kind of with this point. He relates it to the people, this remnant rebuilding the temple. And he tells them basically, you're working on just because you're working on this holy project, you're building this temple, right? Rebuilding this temple, just because you're working on something holy doesn't make you holy just because you're working on it. Rather, if you're sinful, you're unclean, then you'll be making what you're working on unclean or ordinary. It won't mean anything. You see, what God's getting at here, what he was calling the people to do was so much more, and rebuilding the temple was so much more than just putting up walls. It was about restoring the people to heart devotion with God. You see, this temple of God, it symbolized, right, God among his people. So rebuilding the temple is kind of rebuilding the nation's heart back to God, or so that God can be the center of individual lives, just as the temple was the center of the city and the country. So that's what he's getting at. And he says, but if you're doing that, you're going to make it ordinary if you're sinful and you're trying to do it yourself. So he asked the people, he says, I want you to think about something. He uses this phraseology, right? Consider. Remember when he says, anytime he says consider, he says, take this to heart. Really deeply ponder this. And in verse 15, he says, I want you to ponder this. Take this to heart. And consider from this day forward. Or I want you to start thinking about it now, and I want you to continue to think about this so you don't forget. And basically he says, what's it been like since you returned from captivity 18 years ago up until you started to get back to work on the temple? What has 17 years and 9 months been like? He says, how did you fare? How'd it go for you? How'd things work out when you were more devoted to yourselves and your own needs and doing things yourselves rather than to God? How'd it go? Well, he tells them how it went, right? He said, not too good. In fact, you worked hard, but you accomplished a lot less. You put 20 stones up on a wall, but there were only 10. You went to draw 50 measures of wine, yet there were only 20. You were experiencing failure in what you were doing. And the reason you were experiencing failure is because God was disciplining you. He was against you. Right? God was ruining your crops. God was the one that was causing the mildew to come in and all of this, and not sending rain and sending hail to destroy things. It was all because you didn't turn to Him. Although they had returned to the land, they didn't return to Him. They didn't commit their hearts or trust and serve Him. When our hearts are not devoted to God, even when we try to do good things, they fall short. Do you know that? That's what Haggai is saying. You're going to fall short. And then Haggai asks them again in verse 18. He says, all right, you just considered that. Now I want you to consider something else. And I want you again to consider this from this day moving forward, so I don't want you to forget this either. Since you started back to work on the temple, since you returned to God, since you repented, and now you're wanting to do things God's way, and you want to trust Him, how have things gone since you got back to work these last 3 months? And he says, consider, is seed still in the barn? Yeah, it was. Basically, you missed your planting season. You see, during this 6 to 9 month, that this time of year, this was the rainy season. It was when the ground would get softened up and the people would plow, so they would get all their crops ready. This was prime time for them to be taking care of their own needs, to be working on what they needed to be working on. The storehouses were filled with seed. They had to get that seed in the ground. But instead, they were working on the temple. They were following God, doing what God said was most important for them to do. And Haggai says, look around. You missed this. You might be getting a little worried at this point. He says, and then also, all of the things you have already in the ground, your olive trees and your figs and all these things, they haven't produced yet because it's not time for them to produce yet. Are you getting nervous? So he's urging, but what he's doing behind all this is he's saying, it's not working, is it? Maybe you're tempted to say that. And I don't know. Sometimes we can feel like that. Sometimes we can treat God like He's some kind of good luck charm. We say, I have needs in my life, so maybe if I go to church more, God will reward me. God will start to work in a way I should. Maybe, I want God to work in a certain way. I got to pray more. I got to get other people praying more. I got to read my Bible more, maybe go to a small group, maybe do this thing, and maybe even give in the offering. And then God will say, wow, I'm going to work for you. I'm going to reward you. Have you ever kind of got to feeling like that? Well, when our heart's not devoted to Him, and we're just focusing on these outward actions, and we don't see God working the way maybe we think God should be working, what happens? We're tempted to give up, right? We're tempted to say, you know what? God doesn't love me. God's failed. He's not good. He wants me to be miserable. Do you ever feel like that? So Haggai here, he's urging the people, he says, even though all around you is telling you that your needs aren't getting met and some of these things and you don't know where this is all going to come from, keep faithful because it demonstrates heart devotion to God above just doing good deeds, above having other priorities. In fact, he tells them at the end of verse 19, in fact, I want you to know something. Even though you look around and you say, how am I going to get all this stuff? We got to go and work on this again and get distracted. He says, no, from this day forward, God will bless you. Don't worry about your needs. God's got you. You see, Haggai, through this message, he's challenging the people to make sure their heart's devoted to God, but he's also encouraging them to remain holy, to remain devoted to God, even when it's difficult. Do you want that this morning? Do you sit here and say, well, that's what I want in life? You know, I'm tired of being on this hamster wheel that is my spiritual life. Always feeling like I'm performing for God so that He'll do things for me. Always just trying to keep my head above water with doing enough good things to kind of outweigh the bad. Do you know what I mean? Maybe you're here this morning and say, you know, I want to feel secure in my relationship with God. I want to see real victory in my life over those nagging failures that seem to dog us. Find traction in our walk rather than feeling like we're trying to always make good for messing up. Maybe you're here and we want to serve. We want to fellowship. We want to worship with joy rather than out of guilt or out of obligation. Worship and fellowship and serve because we want to and we get to rather than we have to. Have you ever felt like that? Do you long to be authentic? You know what that means? Rather than kind of faking perfection, where you can be honest with God and with others as you grow together. All of this doesn't come from doing more good, or coming to church more, or giving more, or serving more, or reading your Bible more. Rather, it comes through holiness, devoting our hearts to God. In fact, in all these things that we just mentioned, this kind of victory, security, joy, commitment, and all the like, they come as a result of holiness, not to get holiness. And this is Haggai's message, not only to the people of his day, but for us. And we can take this, man, you know what? If I want to build faithfulness, then I need to seek holiness or devote my heart. In fact, as we kind of close the message, we're going to pull this all together. Pull this message together. This third message on building faithfulness. And what we're going to discover is how we can be more holy as well in our life. Come from developing more discipline or doing more. Rather, it comes from trusting more fully what's true about God. You see, in our passage this morning, here's what Haggai teaches. He teaches that our hearts will be devoted to God when we trust, first of all, that our works don't make us holy. Jesus does. Do you know that? We need to, if we want to find holiness in our lives, we need to trust that our works aren't going to be what makes us holy. Only Jesus can make us holy. Again, because it comes from our hearts, right? Only Jesus can change our heart. Just as rebuilding the temple didn't make the remnant of Jews holy, serving, giving, attending, reading our Bible, getting baptized, taking communion, won't make us holy either. There is nothing we can do in and of ourselves to become holy and right with God. In fact, there's another prophet in the Old Testament, Isaiah, who says it like this in Isaiah chapter 64. He says, "We have all become like one who's unclean, and all our righteous deeds, all of our good work, all of our striving are like a polluted garment, like filthy rags. We all fade like a leaf in our iniquities, like the wind that takes us away." Our best deeds, let alone our good deeds, can never be enough when it comes to becoming right or holy with God. Do you know that? Our good isn't good enough to overcome our sin. It's not the outward trappings or how we portray ourselves that make us holy. It's what's inside the garment. You see, in the first illustration, you had this sacrifice that was holy unto God, that was wrapped in this. That's what makes us holy. When we come in proximity to it. But this is what makes us holy. And just as this sacrifice, Jesus is our perfect sacrifice. All of this sacrificial system is a picture of what Jesus does for us. So in this illustration, this sacrifice, Jesus, he's our sacrifice. And when we cling to him, he makes us clean. Paul says it like this in 2 Corinthians. He says, "For our sake, he," meaning God, "made him," Jesus, "to be sin who knew no sin." God made Jesus to be our perfect sacrifice, the perfection we could never have, and the sacrifice that we had to give because of our sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God, so that we might become holy. God does this in Jesus to free us, to not only to free us from the penalty of sin, but to free us from having to worry if we've done enough to outweigh the bad. We've done enough good to be acceptable. He frees us. So instead of performing to be clean, we can respond in appreciation or worship. We can respond because we get to rather than we have to. This freedom and holiness, it's simply found in clinging to what God has already accomplished for us. To trust that. You see, our holiness in Jesus is in Jesus' work, not ours. And because of this work in Jesus, and this work is Jesus' work, and it's complete, we're secure. In fact, Haggai teaches that our hearts will be devoted to God, not only when we trust Jesus to be good for us, but also that we trust that no matter how bad we fall, we can always come back. What was the issue God had with the people since they came back 18 years previous? Why was he disciplining them? Because they didn't come back to him. They came back to their homeland, but they didn't come back to him. And he's saying, if you come back to me, man, I will bless you, right? Because the people came back to him, and what was the final promise? I will bless you from this day forward. You see, no matter how bad we fall, we can always come back to God. The Israelites, they learned this over and over in their history. We saw it when we're looking in Genesis at Abraham, even when he fell, when Isaac fell, when Jacob fell, when the brothers fell. God says, you can come back. No matter how bad they felt, God was willing and waiting to take them back. Sure, there's times they experienced discipline, they experienced consequences, but God's promises and purposes for them never wavered. Aren't you glad God is like he is and God's not a banker or God's not a businessman? Do you know what I mean? Because with a banker or businessman, you mess up once, right? You miss a payment. You fail once at your task. What happens? You're done, right? You lose your car, you lose your house, you lose your job. Very rarely in our world do we get second chances. You know, last week, Becky kind of learned this lesson. Being a freshman in college, you learn all these lessons that you didn't know in high school and you learn them in college. And one thing happened to her last week is that she had an assignment that was due, and she misread the assignment of when it was due. And because she misread it, she missed it. And right after she missed it, she looked at it again and said, uh-oh, I missed the assignment. Well, it's been a short time. I just messed up just a little bit. I'm going to call the professor. She calls the professor and says, listen, I missed this assignment. It was an accident. It's only the first time I did that. You know what the professor told her? You know, in the syllabus, it says if you can't turn in late assignments, and if you try to turn in something late, it's 0. So I'm sorry to tell you, you get a 0. Becky, aren't you glad God is not a professor? Yes. No, God is better than that, isn't he? Rather, God's gracious, and he's faithful to forgive us and to bring us back, and he wants us back. John says in 1 John 1, he says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and he's just to forgive us our sins, to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Even if we confess the same sin 1,000 times, over and over again, we keep coming with the same thing, God doesn't say, one more time. You've almost got your quota. God never says that. God says, yeah, you're forgiven. You're cleansed. No matter how far we feel we may be from God, no matter what we've done, there is nothing too great that God won't forgive. Isn't that awesome? There is nothing, as we saw in Romans, that can separate us from the love of God. And through all of this, God's not only faithful to forgive us, but he's faithful to work in our lives, right? To be active in our lives. The remnant Jews, right? They once wavered because they thought their needs weren't getting met. They got fearful of things that were around them and not having a home and things like that. So they said, we need to take care of ourselves before God. But as Haggai reminds them now that they return to God, and as he wants to remind us, our hearts will be devoted to God when we remember that from God alone comes blessing. It's not through our own hands. It's not through us. We don't bless ourselves. God blesses us. He's the source of our provision. He's the source of our blessing. It's from him that we receive good. We find purpose. We see victory. This will keep us close to him if we have a need, won't it? If we know that God is the source of it, doesn't that want you to be close to him? Do you have any needs? Or is it just me? Yeah, we want to stay close to God. Why? Because he's the source of it. And this truth, it would encourage, right, this remnant Jews to keep working, to not lose heart. Because up to this point, they really hadn't seen things turn around, had they? They're looking around them and they said, how are we going to have crops? We haven't even seen a harvest. What are we going to do? So Haggai reminds them, God's the one who blesses you. Keep trusting, right? Hang in there. You've returned. You're okay. This truth, it should also encourage us, shouldn't it? Helping us to stay committed to God's priorities over our own. But also to stay committed with confidence rather than fear. You see, one that's holy, one that's devoted to God through our hearts. We're not intimidated by what may come because we trust in God. In fact, Isaiah says another place in his writing, in chapter 41, he says, fear not, for I am with you. God says, be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. That's God's encouragement for us. He says, if you're my people, if you're trusting in me, I got you. I'm your source of blessing. We don't have to make things happen. We don't have to manipulate results, or step in to do better, manipulate things so that they look better or seem better. We don't have to rise and fall by what other people think of us, or their opinion of us, what they may say. God is the one who blesses us. God is the one who holds us up, and he holds us together. He's going to take care of us, just like he promises the Jews there. But he also is going to make us effective in pointing others to him, and we're going to see that next week. So, trust God as your source, as your only source of blessing. You see, God cherishes a heart devoted to him more than anything we can do, anything that we can build, and anything that we can accomplish. just as his call to build the temple was for more than just a building, more than just walls, his call for us is for more than what we have or can accomplish. The best that we can ever do for God is to trust him. Trust all that he is for us. And in him, we find our holiness, a heart devoted to God. This is Haggai's third message for the people, but it's his third message for us in building faithfulness. If we want to keep faithful, if we want to have faithfulness built that can get through any storm, it comes when our heart is devoted to God. It comes when we're holy. So be encouraged by this today. Let's pray.